Hi there, I'm UFO researcher Christina Gomez from the Strange and Unexplained podcast, and you're now listening to Somewhere in the Skies.
This is Somewhere in the Skies with Ryan Sprague.
Hi, Ryan. This is Alan Whitehead, former drummer with a pop group called Marmalade. I was with the group from 1967 till 1978. The rest of the group were Scottish except for me, which explains why most nights it would be me driving because they like to drink. Anyway, we're coming back from a gig. It was around about mid-November in 1978, and we just passed Cambridge and we're on the A1, which is one of the main road next, like the M1, but it's the A1, heading back to where we live, which was North London. And as I was driving, one of the things I'd always had an active interest in, ufology and science fiction, so I always kept an eye out when I was driving, partly because it helped keep you awake. And I was always watching for something maybe unusual. And for all the years that I drove, this was the first time that something happened that I couldn't explain. So I'm driving along and I looked to the left and it was like the headlight of a car. A very bright, it seemed sort of circular, but I couldn't distinguish what actual shape it was. All it was a very bright light, and it was moving very erratically. It was moving up, then it would drop down, then it would move to the right, then it would move to the left. And I watched it for about a minute, and then I thought, what the hell is that? So I woke the rest of the three guys. The other guys with me were Graham Knight, the bass player, like me, an original member, and a guy called Sandy Newman and Charlie Smith. So I woke them up and said, what do you think see that light over there? What do you think that is? And Graham said, oh, maybe it's a helicopter. And I said, well, I can't hear any sound, and it's unlikely that a helicopter, generally speaking, apparently, helicopters don't fly at night I assume, for safety reasons. So anyway, we're all watching this light, and then I have to assume that it must have been aware of us because the light suddenly shot across from, I can't say how far it was away from the A1, but within a few seconds, it came to a point literally right in front of us on the A1. So I stopped the car, and we could see it through the windscreen. So all of us got out, and we stood underneath this. I would reckon it was about 50, maybe 70 feet in diameter, and it was maybe 300 foot above us. So the four of us were stood on the A1 looking up at this. It was very luminous, difficult to see any distinguishing marks on. It was just a huge luminous disc, the only way I can describe it. And it was completely silent. So again, Graham looked at me and he said, can you see this? And I went, well, of course I can see it. And he said, well, do you think it's a helicopter? And I said, Graham, listen, it's silent. If it was a helicopter, we'd hear the rotary blades, the whoop, whoop, whoop. It's silent. So we stood underneath it for about a minute, and it just hovered there. It was very sort of surreal, really. And then for no reason that I can explain, it suddenly shot off, and it hit the horizon in about 5 seconds. From your point of vision to the horizon is 25 miles, apparently. Anyway, I noticed that as it moved off, there was it wasn't actually lights, but it was like a discharge of some kind. It was slightly green and slightly orange around the circumference, and it hit the horizon in 5 seconds with no sound. And we just stood there, all of us, thinking, what the hell have we seen? None of us could really explain it, but we all saw exactly the same thing. Luminous discs, 50, maybe 75 foot in diameter, that hovered silently above us. Whatever it was certainly no helicopter, no aircraft, nothing that I had come or seen before in my life, and it was the same for the others. When I got home, I woke my fiancée, who became my wife, and I was so excited. And the next day, I rang the press, because I thought, with a successful group, that they might be interested, but nobody was really interested. So, but the memory of it is as vivid now as it was when it happened. And there's the fact that it's collaborated by 3 other people who all saw exactly what I saw. To this day, that's the only experience I've had of something, if you like, that I can't explain. In the rest of my life looking, I never saw anything else like this. And the memory of it is as vivid as it was, because after all those years watching the skies, it was almost like my wish was fulfilled, and I actually saw something, if you like, from if it came from outer space, who knows? But I know what I saw, and it certainly didn't fall into any category of something that I could explain in a conventional way. And that's my story. Thank you for listening.
Hey Ryan, Violetta here from Melbourne, Australia. I thought I would tell you about my experience that I had only last week. It was one of those moments where I want to say that it was incredibly surreal and incredibly humbling all at the same time. I was driving home from dropping my daughter off at her grandma's, and it was a clear day because we're just approaching summer here in Melbourne now. So it would have been probably 11 in the morning, beautiful blue sky, not a cloud in sight, and a very gentle breeze. So there wasn't really much notable going on, just a typical morning. As I was approaching these traffic lights, which usually are a huge pain and they always stop cars for a really long time, I already started sort of drifting away, letting my attention slip from the road because I knew I'd be there for a while. Then something did catch my eye that wasn't extremely normal, which I never see here. It was an object. It was egg-shaped, and I remember really distinctly because I immediately went to the thought of every UFO story I've ever heard. It's a cigar shape, or it's completely round, or it's a disc, as we typically know. But this was a very obvious egg. And when I say obvious, I was looking at it from about 100 meters away. and it would have been about the same height. So it wasn't high enough to be completely obscured in terms of the shape or the style, but it was far away enough that I couldn't make out if there were obviously any doors, openings, rivets, or any kinds of joins. So the shape itself was very smooth, very round at the bottom with the egg-shaped tip on top. And it was solid as far as I could tell. There weren't any kind of depressions in it. It didn't look like it was transparent in any way, shape, or form. And it was just gliding very slowly from the left to the right. And remember, I mentioned there was a very gentle breeze, so I immediately thought it might have been a balloon, but even with a gentle breeze, a balloon would have looked a little bit more erratic than this did, and this had a very clear line of travel. It was like I was saying, it was going from left to right, and I watched it for a good 20 to 30 seconds as I was waiting at these pesky traffic lights. And towards the end, as the object neared the end of my line of vision, it started to get smaller and smaller and smaller until it blinked out. So my mind immediately began to process, could this have been a drone? Potentially yes, because of the way that it was moving, very direct in terms of its flight and direction. However, I've never seen a drone that has this kind of get up on it, but I guess somebody could have done it to be pranking everyone. I haven't read anything about it. I do follow a few pages here in Australia and in Melbourne specifically about these kinds of sightings, and nothing was mentioned. And then I went to debunking thought process of whether it was a balloon, but again, that erratic movement that balloons generally do when it is even a very gentle breezy day, there was no erratic movements. It was very direct in its flight path. And then naturally the getting smaller and then blinking out, I've never seen anything like that, and I've never heard of anything like that that's natural or that we know of. So that was another thing that I couldn't debunk as well. And then just the fact that it was such a very obvious egg shape and very smooth in its appearance and very solid, that again told me that it probably wasn't any of those three things that I thought it was initially. And once it blinked out and the lights went green and I started driving, I had a good 5 minutes before I reached home to think about it. And I immediately reached out to my sister and told her all about it as well, because she's a really avid supporter and follower of your show too. And both of us tried to debunk it and discuss it, and I've subsequently gone back to the location to see if it could have been anything else, if it could have been a balloon or a decoration that was released from one of the stores, because there are a few grand openings. But again, there's really nothing that I could think of that would glide with such purpose and direction and then also reduce in size and then blink out eventually. So I'm at a complete loss. And like I said at the start of this message to you, it was a feeling of surrealism, but awe and wonder as well. And I feel quite humbled that I got to witness something like this. It's not my first UFO sighting or UAP, but it's definitely the first as an adult that I can remember and recall so vividly, and the feelings associated with. So, I'm really humbled I got to have that experience, and I'd love to know if anyone else has seen anything or heard of anything like it. If not, I'm glad it's a first. It's a first for me. Love your show, and thank you so much for being the champion of UFO supporters and experiences. Have a good day.
My name is Bob Burke. I want to tell you a story about my UFO sighting. And I'm going to tell you this story because there seems to be a link between the phenomenon and who sees it. And this is sort of being told in the story of War, Tom DeLonge and Peter Levenda. I'm in the midst of reading their book right now. But that's one of the points they're making, is very seriously the idea that those who were initially involved in the Roswell crash in 1947 had not only a synchronous pattern leading them up to it, but after it. And this UFO sighting is really kind of different than I've heard anyone else talk about. And I wasn't the only one who saw it, so it's not that it's uncorroborated. But at the time that it happened, it was probably fall of 2016. I'm almost certain of the timing. I want to say it was probably mid or early October. It was cold out. And it was about 9:30, 9:40 at night, and I was living east of Hudson, Wisconsin, along Interstate 94 in a townhome. And my side of the townhome faced directly east, directly east. And so at about 9:30, 9:40, my dog wanted to go out, which is just normal what happens. And so I go to the door, and as I look out the glass of the door, and as I'm opening it, I see up in the clouds, there's this light in the trees that's moving across the trees. Now, at this point, I'd been there for about a year, and I knew just from experience, even from flying, that the planes came in for the airport at Minneapolis-St. Paul often when they use the route straight along I-94. So me looking out the window, it was common to see a plane coming in this direction, a white light anyway, even if you couldn't hear it. But this one was going in this direction. This light was going across, which really caught my eye. And so I let the dog out and I walked down the walk to see because this thing was moving through the trees. So I walked down the walk and I got around the end. And as I get around the end, there's a giant obelisk floating in the sky, slowly, quietly floating across the sky. And there's a second one at the end of my driveway flying directly over the center of the neighborhood. And just as I'm seeing these two things coming across, my daughters come home. And so they had been in marching band at the time, and marching band practice had gotten over, and they were just arriving home, and they got out and literally said, "Papa, is this that UFO thing?" And I'm like, "Yes, this is that UFO thing." So it wasn't just an obelisk like you might see a stone obelisk, but rather it was the shape of an obelisk against a very dark sky. Come here. Against a very dark sky. And that dark sky, come on. And that dark sky, in front of it was this giant obelisk. At the very top, there's two lights. I'm trying to remember if there was a red one on top or the red one was on bottom. I believe the red one was on bottom. And yes, there was a red one and a white one. Maybe the white was on bottom. That's what I saw first. And that white light above it had a V. You could see the silhouetted outsides, and then you could see the line connecting it where that triangle ended. And then you could see these very light silhouetted lines that went up the top and made up the top of, well, as I said, at the top of one of these objects, just floating there. And as best I could tell, there were other similar lights like them in other places. And so, my daughter stayed out for a couple of minutes and then they went in, and I stayed out for about 20 because at that point they'd kind of gone off into the distance. They'd become a light that I could still see, but I couldn't really tell what it was. And so after about 20 minutes, and I was quite cold and I wasn't wearing shoes, I decided to head in. I reported it to MUFON, and I don't recall how long or how much later the call came in, but I got a call and they left a message, and it was a woman. And I believe she said she was from Minnesota MUFON. And she left the most odd message. She said, "Mr. Burke, we got your report, and what you've reported is what we generally call a UFO disc." I'm like, I reported a freaking obelisk. I did not report a disc. I have no idea what you're talking about. Clearly you don't mean to get a hold of me. And so I just didn't respond to the email or to the voicemail. Well, a couple of weeks later, might have been a few months even, I don't recall for sure, I got a call from an elderly gentleman. Got me what his name was. But he took the full report of what happened. And I did upload a video and some pictures to it, but you really can't see much because, again, it was just these very light silhouetted lines against a very dark sky that it itself looked almost translucent against. Yeah. And so that was my UFO sighting. And I don't have any other really unique UFO sightings. I saw an orb one time fly over my house, two of them, which was odd, but that was back in like 2012 or 2014. And so UFOs are really unique. They're telling us something. We just have to try and figure out what. Thank you, and peace out, everybody.
This is a story I've not told many people, mainly because it sounds crazy. but it's my truth. I was on the way from Philippines for the second time, coming home on an airliner, and we're very high up in the sky, incredibly high, above the clouds. And everything was peaceful, quiet for a time. Then there was an announcement over the tannoy. The pilot came over the tannoy announcing that all the air hostesses should walk down the aisles, closing the window blinds on the aircraft because we're due to fly through turbulence. Now, I know a little about flying. I've flown a lot before. It didn't make any sense to me because flying through turbulence, closing the shutters, would not have any effect on the turbulence at all. We'd still feel it. So the air hostesses hadn't reached my seat yet, and I half closed mine, and I saw something pass under the aircraft. It was travelling really, really fast. It was travelling so fast I didn't see any flight surfaces, wings, anything. And it flew away from the aircraft. Imagine the aircraft was flying from south to north in a straight line, and this thing flew under the aeroplane from west to east, directly under the aeroplane. And it left behind it what looked to me like a contrail. It was perfectly round, and if you looked down into the centre of it, this contrail, it was just like a kind of moiling smoke, which I guess from the ground could be mistaken for a contrail. The thing flew away from the aeroplane and vanished over the horizon, and the aircraft flew on. Then the pilot came over the intercom again to say that the hostesses could open the shutters because the turbulence was past. But the problem that struck me was there was no turbulence. Nothing. No shaking of the aeroplane, no noise, nothing. Just this thing flying away underneath the aircraft. I think that if that thing would have been maybe 200 feet, 150, 200 feet up, it would have gone straight through the aeroplane. Now, I think that the pilot chose to have the shutters closed on the aeroplane for two reasons. One, because he didn't want people on the right-hand side of the aeroplane to see it coming, and two, because he didn't want people on the right-hand side, the people on the left, to see it coming, the people on the right to see it going, and how close it was beneath the aircraft. Now, I want to put out an appeal here. Was anyone else on that flight, anyone in the world on that flight from the Philippines in the early 80s, late 90s, around about that time, and were told to close the shutters by the pilot, and the air hostesses came along up the aisle to close your shutters? Did you see something coming, or did you see something going? I'm not saying it's a flying saucer. I don't know what it was. All I know, it was something very, very, very strange that the pilot and the co-pilot didn't want you to see. Are there any other passengers out there who've been told to close their shutters because of turbulence or some other reason? Thank you for listening.
Hi, Ryan and everyone at our incredible group at Somewhere in the Skies. This is Suzanne, your moderator, and this is my UFO experience. It happened when I was 6 or 7 years old, which was maybe 1966 or 67, in a tiny town in Arkansas, not too far from Little Rock. My grandmothers lived about a 2-block zigzag from each other, and they would typically walk me to one corner and let me run to the other grandmother on the other corner. But one day they let me know that they thought that I was mature enough for me just to go on my own as long as the other grandmother knew where I was. I was a really responsible kid, and this was a big deal for me. I was really proud of this new responsibility. So one sunny summer morning at about 10, I left one grandmother's house for the other grandmother's house, and just as I was about to make my first turn, there was suddenly a deafening, chest-rattling roar overhead. And at the same time, I saw an enormous object, literally city blocks long, flying directly overhead, very close to the ground, and you can imagine that it terrified me. I watched, shaking, thinking this was a plane that was crashing. And at this young age, I'd never seen underneath a plane close up. So the fact that it was covered in multicolored lights meant literally nothing to me. Neither did I have any reference at all for something like a UFO or an alien. So I stood there frozen in fear until I crouched to the ground and covered my ears. The sound was literally shaking my little body. And then I finally got my courage up and stood up, still watching this thing move slowly. But literally nothing happened. No car stopped. No pedestrians paused. No one else seemed to notice anything at all. Not even me, a terrified little girl standing there on the corner watching this. And there was no explosion, so I knew something was different about it, that this was not a crashing plane. So, shaking head to toe, I finally uncovered my ears and raced back to the grandmother I'd just left, trying to calm myself before I got there, because I was afraid that if I came bursting into the house and told this story, that they might decide that I really wasn't mature enough to have this newly found privilege. But my grandmother was the county health nurse, and I knew that she needed to go help, and if this was a crashing plane, which is what I thought it might be, then she needed to get in her car and go. So I told her, and I begged her to come outside, and she hadn't heard anything, and she didn't see anything, she didn't feel anything, and it just didn't make any sense to me because it was so big and so loud and so close that it literally rattled my tiny body. And for years, I frequently returned to the memory of it, trying to make sense of it. In the 90s, I considered maybe a UFO being the answer when I first read about them, but I quickly discounted that idea because the people who were talking about their experiences at that time recorded silence, and mine was so loud. Then later on, once the internet was out, I would search for plane crashes in central Arkansas in 66 or 67, all to no avail. I just didn't understand what had happened. Had I not understood what I was seeing? Nobody else seemed to see it. Was I just too little? I didn't know. But last year, while vacationing in Scotland, I picked up Whitley Strieber's latest book, and it involved a bunch of witness encounters. And the first 2 stories in that book were from about the same time frame as mine, and also involved really loud noises. And it was only then that I realized that there really was a possible, understandable explanation for what had happened to me, but that it might not be a comfortable one. However, I was able to finally lay down the query about what it was. I'm quite confident that what I saw was not of human origin. I can't tell you what it was, but it was definitely real, and it was physical. It produced physical reactions in a small child. And I finally, by virtue of reading about this in Mr. Strieber's book, got the courage to tell my family about what had happened to me, and so grateful for how encouraging and supportive they were, because I know not everybody gets that. So for those like you and Mr. Strieber who are determined to tell the witness stories and put down the data in a non-judgmental way, I want you to know how important I think that work is, because every time you tell a person's story, you're handing another person a gift, and that gift is to be able to make sense of what happened to them. So thank you for doing it. I appreciate it.
The Somewhere in the Skies podcast is part of the LIONSGATE Sound Network. Please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever possible. Thank you for listening.